was 25 years old when this happened, and at the time, hunting was probably my biggest hobby. I lived in a small town in Montana and spent most of my free time outdoors. Hunting had always been something me and my dad did together growing up, and once I got older, it became one of the few things that actually helped me clear my head. There was something relaxing about being deep in the woods, away from people and noise for a couple of days. Every November, I would take a week off of work during elk season and head into the mountains by myself. Usually I stayed at public campgrounds or slept in the bed of my truck, depending on where I was hunting. That year, I decided to try a new area I hadn't hunted before. One of my coworkers told me about a stretch of national forest roughly 3 hours west of where I lived. He had told me hardly anybody hunted there because the terrain was rough and there weren't many trails leading through the area, and to me that sounded perfect. Less hunters usually meant more elk. I left early on a Thursday morning before sunrise and spent most of my drive listening to music and drinking gas station coffee, just trying to keep myself awake. By the time I reached the forest, it was a little after noon. The area was beautiful but isolated. There was one dirt road leading into the mountains, and after about 20 minutes of driving, I completely lost cell service. I remember noticing how empty the place felt. There were no other trucks or campsites, not even hikers. Eventually, I found a small clearing near a creek and decided to set up camp there for the weekend. The first day went pretty normally. I spent a few hours hiking ridges and looking for tracks before heading back to camp around dark. I cooked some food over my propane stove and sat by the fire for another hour before climbing into my tent for the night. That first night was when things started to feel strange. I woke up sometime around 2 a.m. needing to use the bathroom. At first, I just laid there in my sleeping bag staring at the roof of the tent, trying to convince myself to go back to sleep because it was freezing outside. That's when I heard something. There were footsteps. At first, they were very slow, and they were moving through the woods near my campsite. At first, I assumed it was a deer or maybe even a bear wandering nearby. That wasn't unusual out there. But what bothered me was how deliberate the steps sounded, almost cautious, like whatever it was trying not to make noise. I stayed completely still, just listening. The footsteps circled slowly around my campsite for maybe 30 seconds before stopping completely, and silence filled the woods. I waited another minute expecting to hear movement again, but there was nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was probably an animal and drifted back to sleep. That next morning, I almost forgot about it entirely. I spent most of the day hiking deeper into the mountains, following fresh elk tracks I found near a ridgeline. Around sunset, I finally got my chance at a bull elk moving through the trees roughly 150 yards ahead of me. I raised my rifle, and I dropped it with one shot. By the time I field dressed the elk and packed out what I could, it was getting dark fast. I remember feeling uneasy hiking back to camp that night. Not scared exactly, just uncomfortable, like I was being watched. I kept catching myself turning around, expecting to see another hunter behind me, even though I knew no one else was out there. By the time I got back to my camp, it was fully dark. I built a fire almost immediately, mostly because the woods felt creepier than usual that night. The entire forest was dead quiet. There was no wind or insects. I sat by the fire eating jerky and trying to relax when I heard it. A whistle. It came from somewhere deep in the trees beyond my camp. It was low and short, almost like someone trying to get another person's attention. I froze immediately. There shouldn't have been anyone else out there. I listened carefully, and a few seconds later the whistle came again. This time it was closer. I stood up from my chair, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight, and called out hello. I didn't receive a response, just silence. I told myself it was probably another hunter messing around, or maybe even some weird bird sound echoing through the trees, but honestly, I didn't believe that. I added more wood to the fire and stayed awake another hour before finally climbing into my tent. Just in case, I kept my rifle beside me that night. Sometime later, I woke up again, this time to a sound so close it instantly made my blood run cold. It was breathing, heavy breathing just outside of my tent. I froze completely. The sound moved slowly along the outside fabric. I could hear footsteps too. Whatever was out there was circling my tent. And the breathing sounded wrong. It was deep and raspy. I reached slowly for my rifle, trying not to make noise. And the footsteps stopped near the front zipper of the tent. And then complete silence. I sat there barely breathing, waiting for something to happen. Then suddenly the side of the tent pushed inward violently like something had shoved it with both hands. I yelled and scrambled backward, nearly tangling myself in my sleeping bag. The tent wall released immediately, snapping back into place, and then I heard running. Fast footsteps crashing through the woods away from my camp. I sat there the rest of the night holding my rifle, staring at the tent door, waiting for daylight. The second the sun came up, I stepped outside, and what I found terrified me. There were footsteps all around my campsite, human footprints, and they were barefoot. I stared at them, trying to process what I was seeing. The tracks circled my tent repeatedly, some only inches from where my head had been while I slept. I immediately started packing my gear. I didn't even care about the elk hunt anymore. I just wanted to get out of those woods. As I loaded my truck, I kept scanning the tree line, feeling that same sensation that someone was watching me. Then I noticed something about 40 yards into the woods to my left. At first, I thought it was a tree stump, but then it moved. A man was standing there between the trees, staring directly at me. He was completely still. He was tall and painfully thin, with tangled hair hanging around his face, and he wasn't wearing any clothes. I couldn't fully make out his features through the trees, but I could see enough to know something about him looked wrong. Not supernatural, just deeply wrong and unsettling. Like someone who had been living out there for a very long time. The second I spotted him, he slowly stepped backward behind a tree and disappeared. I threw the rest of my gear into the truck and got out of there as fast as I ever have in my entire life. I ended up reporting what happened to a ranger station on my way home. The ranger got pretty quiet while I explained everything. Then he asked me something that made my stomach drop. He asked if the footprints were barefoot. When I said yes, his expression changed immediately. Apparently, over the previous few years, there had been multiple reports from hunters in that area claiming someone had been stalking campsites deep in the forest. People reported whistles outside tents at night, food disappearing, even footprints circling camps. One hunter even claimed someone tried opening his tent while he slept, but nobody had ever officially found whoever was responsible. I still hunt to this day, but I never camp alone anymore. And any time I hear unexplained sounds outside at night in the woods, I leave immediately. I was 27 years old when this happened, and at the time hiking had become my way of dealing with stress. I had just gotten out of a pretty rough relationship, and instead of sitting around my apartment thinking about it every night, I started spending my weekends outdoors. There was something about being deep in the woods with no phone service and no people around that helped clear my head. Most of the time I stuck to popular trails around Oregon, but after a while I started looking for more isolated places. That's what led me to the Forest Service Trail where this happened. I found the trail online while scrolling through hiking forums late one night. People described it as beautiful but difficult because of how remote it was. Apparently, the trail stretched nearly 18 miles through dense forest before eventually ending near an abandoned fire road deep in the mountains. What interested me most was how many people mentioned never seeing another person out there. At the time, that sounded peaceful to me. Now, looking back, it sounds like the dumbest thing I could have ever looked for. I drove out there on a Friday afternoon in early September, planning to spend one night on the trail before hiking back the next morning. The deeper I drove into the woods, the worse the road became. Eventually, pavement turned to gravel, and gravel turned into uneven dirt filled with potholes and washed-out sections. By the time I reached the trailhead, my car was completely covered in mud. There was only one other vehicle parked there. It was an older green pickup truck with faded paint and cracked windows. I remember noticing it because the truck looked abandoned. There was dirt caked over the tires and pine needles piled beneath it like it had been sitting there a while. I figured maybe someone was camping nearby. I grabbed my backpack and started hiking around 4 in the afternoon. The trail itself was beautiful. There were massive pine trees that towered overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight, and the deeper I hiked, the quieter everything became. At some points, the woods were so still I could hear my own breathing. About 3 hours into the hike, I found a decent clearing beside a creek and decided to set up camp there for the night. The area felt isolated, but peaceful. At least at first it did. I made some food on my portable stove while the sun disappeared behind the trees, and after eating, I just sat beside the creek listening to the water move over the rocks. That's when I heard the first strange sound. It came from somewhere uphill behind my campsite. A loud cracking noise, like someone stepping on a thick branch. I turned immediately, expecting to see another hiker, but there was nothing there. I stared into the trees for a few seconds before convincing myself it was probably a deer or an elk moving through the woods. But still, it bothered me because the sound had been heavy. As darkness settled in, I climbed into my tent and tried watching videos on my phone for a while before realizing I had no signal whatsoever. Eventually, I zipped my sleeping bag and drifted off to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was completely dark outside. At first, I wasn't even sure why I woke up, but then I heard it. There were slow footsteps circling somewhere outside my tent. I immediately held my breath and just listened. The footsteps weren't moving like an animal. They had rhythm to them, intentional rhythm, like a person slowly walking around camp. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to shine the beam outside, but there was nothing. The woods beyond my campsite looked completely empty. The footsteps stopped the second the light appeared. I stayed there listening for maybe another minute before eventually zipping the tent shut again. I just kept telling myself it was another hiker, maybe someone who got turned around in the dark. But still, something about the silence afterward made me uncomfortable. There were no insects, no wind, no movement at all. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back to sleep. The next morning, I almost laughed at myself for being so paranoid. Everything looked normal. I packed my gear and continued further down the trail toward the old fire road. Around noon, I finally reached it. The road itself was mostly overgrown with weeds and fallen branches, but you could still see that vehicles had once driven there years ago. I stopped to eat lunch near an old rusted gate blocking the road, and that's when I noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints in the mud nearby. At first, I just stared at them confused. The prints looked recent, too. The mud inside them still had water. I remember trying to rationalize it in my head. Maybe somebody crossed the creek earlier. But the farther I followed the tracks with my eyes, the stranger they became. The footprints disappeared directly into thick woods off the side of the road. There was no campsite or trail, just dense forest. I suddenly got this overwhelming feeling that I shouldn't be there anymore. I packed up quickly and started hiking back toward my campsite so I could head home before dark. About an hour into the hike, I heard something behind me. Another footstep. I stopped walking immediately, but there was silence. I turned around, scanning the trail behind me, and there was nothing. The trail stretched empty through the trees. I turned around and kept walking. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was a crunch, like a tree branch snapping. This time I spun around instantly, but still, there was nothing. At this point, my nerves were starting to get bad. I knew someone was behind me. I could feel it. But every time I turned around, the woods looked empty. The sun was starting to go down now, and shadows stretched across the trail, making the forest feel darker than it actually was. Then I saw movement. Roughly 50 yards behind me between the trees. A figure stepped briefly into view before disappearing behind another tree. I froze immediately. The person looked short and thin, but the distance and trees made it hard to make out details. I called out hello, but this was useless because I got no response. I stood there waiting. Nothing moved. I told myself maybe it was another hiker trying to avoid me, or maybe I was just letting paranoia get the better of me. But then I heard something that made every hair on my body stand up. It was someone humming. It was a low, uneven hum that drifted through the trees behind me. It wasn't even a song. It was almost like random notes. It was slow and almost sounded playful. I started walking faster, but the humming continued, always somewhere behind me. Sometimes it was close, other times farther away. At one point, I could swear I heard it off to my right instead, like whoever it was had moved through the woods to keep pace with me. By now, I was genuinely terrified. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting someone to come charging out of the trees, but every time I looked back, I saw nothing. Just endless forest. Eventually, I reached the clearing where I had camped the night before. My car was still another few miles away. The sun had almost completely disappeared by now, and panic was starting to settle in hard. That's when I noticed my tent. Someone had gone through it. The zipper was wide open, and my gear was scattered around the campsite. My sleeping bag had been dragged halfway toward the tree line. I immediately knew this wasn't some animal. As I stood there frozen, staring at the mess, I heard that same humming again, this time directly behind me, and it was close. I whipped around so fast I almost fell. And about 20 feet away from me, at the edge of the trees, stood a man. He was extremely skinny and filthy, like he'd been living outdoors for years. His beard hung down almost to his chest, and his clothes looked soaked with mud. But what terrified me most was the expression on his face. He looked excited, like he was enjoying watching me panic. He smiled slowly and tilted his head slightly to one side, and then he hummed again. I didn't say a word. I grabbed my backpack and ran. I don't think I've ever run faster in my life. I could hear movement crashing through the woods behind me as I sprinted down the trail. The branches were snapping and footsteps pounded the dirt. At one point, I risked a glance backward and saw him weaving between the trees, keeping pace with me easily, still smiling. I genuinely thought I was going to die out there. By the time I finally reached the trailhead, it was almost dark. I sprinted straight to my car, fumbling my keys so badly I dropped them twice before getting the door unlocked. As I peeled out of the parking area, I looked toward the old green pickup truck, and that's when I realized something that still bothers me. The truck's driver door was hanging open, like someone had just gotten out of it. I reported everything to the sheriff's department once I got back into town. The officer told me they'd had reports over the years about a transient man living deep in those woods. Apparently, hikers had reported campsites being disturbed and hearing humming at night, but nobody had ever managed to catch him. I never went back there, and to this day, if I ever hear humming while hiking in the woods, I know I'm in trouble.